With the United States in the depths of the Civil War, and Great Britain experiencing the battle between the Gothic revivalists Ruskin and Scott versus the aristocratic traditionalists, let's go back and see what's happening in Paris at the same time during the 1850s. Earlier, I had said that the year 1848 was a year of revolution throughout Europe. It was preceded by a number of years of crop failures that started in Belgium in 1845 and quickly spread to Ireland in the form of the Great Potato Blight. Then there will be an economic downturn throughout Europe that only increased the pressures on the lower classes. The actual revolt started in France, where the people had had a taste of liberty during the First Republic, that is, until Napoleon proclaimed the empire in 1804. And then they had watched Britain expand the voting rights for its citizens with the 1832 reforms. It was in February 1848 when the King Louis Philippe abdicated in the face of barricades in the streets that finally resulted in the formation of the Second Republic, that is to distinguish it from the First Republic, which was in power from the 1789 revolution to Napoleon proclaiming the First Empire in 1804, that it set off similar revolts throughout Europe. France has been the most unstable country in Europe since the 1789 revolution. In other words, they had had the revolution in 1789, but Napoleon took over the government and eventually proclaimed it to be an empire in 1804. So I will need you to know the names of the various French governments because that's how this period's architecture and art is classified. In other words, Napoleon's era is called Empire or First Empire. For example, if you know women's fashion, the emperor waist was made fashionable at this time in France, hence its name. Napoleon was defeated by the European powers that reinstituted the monarchy, so the French were once again being governed by a king. There were 3 kings from 1815 to 1848. The last king, Louis Philippe, sees trouble on the horizon in February of 1848 and doesn't want to end up like Louis XVI did, and so he got out of Paris quickly. This resulted in a power vacuum, and so the barricades went up once again in the streets, and were in the throes of another battle in Paris between the various political factions. There will eventually be at least 5 political factions vying for the control of the country. First, there are the Bourbons. They are monarchists of the firstborn branch of the family, who were conservative or traditional. Then there are the Orleanists, who are also monarchists, but for the second brother or the next in line in the family, who tended to be more liberal and favored a parliament. Third, there were Bonapartists, that is, followers of Napoleon, the emperor, which is not the same as a king. Fourth, there were conservative Republicans from the First Revolution. And fifth, there are radical Republicans, and there were 2 main groups of these: proto-communists who will eventually succeed in taking over Paris for a brief period, and the anarchists led by Mikhail Bakunin. What shocked me as I researched French history is that these 5 groups continued to exist up through the Second World War, where some of the monarchists had still hoped that Hitler, after defeating the Third Republic, would reinstitute the monarchy. There will be 4 governments in power in France between 1815 and 1871. This is the reason I call France the least stable country in Europe at this time. On the right is a street scene from a Prussian city that also erupted in 1848. These are the 2 bookends for this lecture. We will start with France in the ascendancy, only to run into the political machinations of the Prussians in 1870, who we will then discuss. Let's start in Paris. What I enjoy about this painting of the 1848 revolt in Bloody June is the fact that here's the Pantheon in the background, so we can start tying together what I've shown you so far. There's a battle going on in 1848 between these various factions to get control of the French government. The radicals try to reinstitute the revolution, including national workshops, while the middle class, remembering the terror of the guillotine, want no part of that. The national government, led by the conservative Republicans, have control over the army, and they set them loose on Paris's radicals in 3 days of June, with about 4,500 people being killed in the streets. One of the factors for all this disruption in 1848 is Karl Marx's recent publication of the Communist Manifesto. Although being a German, he wrote it in a cafe at the Galerie des Bois in the Royal Palais, because he had been forced out of German territory because of his ideas, and he was working his way throughout Europe wherever people would take him. He was in Paris at this time and will be one of the contributing factors for the revolt. We will see the influence of his communist philosophy succeed in the formation of the first communist government with the Paris Commune of 1870. In Paris, when you have a revolution, all you do is pick up the stones in the street and pile them up in a narrow street, and you have yourself a barricade. With Paris's winding medieval streets, it was easy to shut down a part of the city. The movie Les Miserables showed how this was done, right? A couple of troublemakers start piling up the paving stones, shout, "Vive la République!" and everyone starts throwing their furniture out their windows, right? Come on! These are poor people who have little furniture, but what they have is very dear to come by. And you want me to believe that these folks are just going to throw their mattress out the window? And suppose you lose. What do you do then for the next 4 years? Paris is still a medieval city, so it's really quite easy to block off the street and declare a revolution, as these photos show. After wiping out the pockets of radical resistance, the national government held an election that was won by the Party of Order, that was led by, of all people, the son of Napoleon's brother, that is, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon's nephew was a very intelligent man and a shrewd politician, whose philosophy was somewhat different from his uncle's. Most important was that he was committed to universal suffrage, that is, as long as they voted for him, and the social improvement of the middle class. He won the election by 70%, and within 3 years led a coup d'etat to take over the government, and by December of 1852 had reestablished the empire, so this government would be known as the Second Empire. He will refer to himself as Napoleon III, as Bonaparte supporters referred to the son of Napoleon as Napoleon II, as he was the titular emperor of France following his father's abdication for a month or so in 1815 before the Allied forces had marched into Paris. Second Empire will also be the name for the style of the architecture of this 22-year period, such as the Paris Opera House. Napoleon III will be in power for over 22 years, from 1848 to 1870, the longest period of a single French leader since the Revolution, attesting to his political genius. We are interested in him because of his program to remake Paris into the city you know and most people love today. So I want to introduce you to his program for renovating Paris. This is what Paris looked like before he took over power, a real slum. The most populous city in Europe in 1848. 750,000 people living in these quarters with no sewers, dark, dank, little sunlight making it to the sidewalks, especially in winter. In 1832, a cholera outbreak resulted in over 20,000 deaths. In Europe at this time, it was normal that 4 out of 7 children born died before their first birthday. It's really the pits, and this is what he wants to reform. In his inaugural address, Napoleon had articulated his vision for the city to the municipal council. Quote, "Major arteries opening, populous areas becoming healthier, rents tending to get lower as a result of more and more building, the working class getting richer through work, poverty diminishing through better organization of relief, and Paris responding to its highest calling." Unquote. Now, depending upon where you fall on the political spectrum, you may say trickle-down economics. You may also say that he's trying to kick out all the poor rabble-rousers by building more expensive apartments, and yes, that's his plan. Paris is going to become the Paris we know, where there are very few poor people living in the heart of the city because they will no longer be able to afford the rising costs. This is what he changes it into. But it's not just to make it better, because in those curving medieval alleys, you can't shoot a cannon because you can't get a straight line of fire. So if I want to bring in artillery to squash a rebellion, then I better have some straight lines of fire. It also makes it a lot easier to bring troops down straight streets than marching them back and forth around a series of blockades. So Napoleon's plan for Paris is a double-edged sword. Because he is also building the railroads throughout the country with Paris as the system's hub, he wants to build straight streets between all the troubled areas and the railroad stations so that he can bring in troops from other parts of the city as well as the countryside. So he can ship in the army, march them down the straight streets, and end a revolt during the first day of an uprising. We can also get rid of these poor who start these revolts by demolishing their neighborhoods and replacing them with building middle-class apartments. So he's going to take care of his enemies in more than one way by giving us the Paris that we know and love. It is estimated that over 20,000 housing units were demolished in the process, but at the same time, over 40,000 units replaced these. And during this process, over 350,000 people were displaced. Maybe it's better to say dispersed, many of those to slums along the city's periphery. One of the urban design elements about his plan for Paris are these long, straight boulevards that create these long, broad vistas that are terminated with an important structure, such as the Arc de Triomphe or the Opera House. Almost all of these grand boulevards in Paris were the product of Napoleon III's Second Empire. We've already seen the evolution of the Parisian streetwalker, La Flaneur, so Napoleon is simply improving Paris to support an even more majestic urban lifestyle for the bourgeoisie. Which is, of course, what one does in Paris, for which it is famous. Everybody's going to copy the Parisian model. It becomes a competition among Europe's monarchs. Vienna is going to do the same thing, except that Vienna had a circular city wall, as it was being attacked from all sides. So when Vienna tore down its wall, it built the Ringstrasse, on the same model of what's happening in Paris. The Champs-Élysées is the famous street, and so famous, of course, that the Germans wanted to parade on it, and so they got their chance a couple of times, and so did the Americans. So everybody just wants to enjoy walking down this grand boulevard. But again, to remind you why this is being done. Nobody had done anything to this medieval city that had grown up over centuries. So what we're going to do is we're first going to take out the bulldozers, and then we're going to wipe the slate clean, tabula rasa one more time. Almost no one is interested in keeping any of this slum. It's just one big cesspool that is also a tinderbox. There's no historic preservation here. Get the bulldozers going. In fact, we aren't even going to worry about the existing street patterns. We're going to make entirely new neighborhoods. You can't get much straighter lines than these, can you? And of course, it is simply coincidental that these lines run straight from a train station to the various trouble spots throughout the city. So we're going to condemn the properties that look like this, right? This is what you want to keep? Oh, no, 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 no. And we're going to make it look like this. An amazing transformation in only 20 years' time. And again, the people who now live here are not going to be the same rabble-rousers who had started each of the revolutions. We're going to divide and conquer them. The guy that Napoleon puts in charge of this program is Georges Eugène Haussmann, Baron Haussmann, a French civil servant who has worked his way up the system and was noticed by the emperor just at the right moment. He is appointed by Napoleon III as the prefect of the Seine, the mayor of Paris, if you will. But a French mayor is more than just a mayor. He is the emperor's representative, and what he says goes. Something like Richard J. Daley in Chicago during the 1950s and 60s. The British have a term for such a powerful leader, plenipotentiary. Haussmann will hold this position for some 18 years, so the process of this urban renewal will be called Haussmannization, even though he was put in charge by Napoleon to make his plan a reality. Haussmann usually gets all the credit and also all the blame when people start complaining about tearing down the existing fabric, as if any of it was worth saving in the first place. So here is the Ile de Cité with Notre Dame before Haussmann, and here is the Ile de Cité with Notre Dame after Haussmann. Entirely new roads, the scale of the city has been changed, everything that used to be there is wiped clean. The process went like this. Haussmann expropriates the land from its former owners, demolishes the existing buildings, that is, once again, creating a tabula rasa, a clean slate. You will hear critics of the international style of the 1950s blame Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe for the idea of wiping out complete neighborhoods and replacing them with new buildings. But I want you to remember that they had great examples of such urban renewal to learn from by the architects who were trained at the Académie des Beaux-Arts. Haussmann then lays down new roads, water mains, sewers, gas street lamps, trees, and street furniture, and then sells the property to developers to develop the new apartments and the new stores. What gives the new construction its aesthetic appeal is that there is an established set of laws that govern the design of the streets and the buildings. There is a constant cornice height, which was basically 20 meters or 66 feet if the street was 20 meters wide. There is no elevator yet, so 5 to 6 stories is maximum. So all they've done is to codify what your legs already know. This made sure that all the new buildings were completed to the same height, so as to avoid anyone making a shorter or taller building. The objective was to make these buildings a backdrop for the life going on along the sidewalk. The floors are basically the same height, so they can all line up, so architecturally they hold together as an ensemble very nicely. Therefore, no one's building gets to shout out to get attention. Second, it's all the same material. It's a beautiful light gray stone that on a nice day is bright, but on a gray winter day gets very monotonous sometimes. Third, we're trying to make it much more healthier, sunny, and drier down on the streets and sidewalks. Therefore, you are also required on the top floor to slope the roof back at a 45-degree angle in order to encourage as much daylight to penetrate to the sidewalk as possible. This results in what we call the Monsod Roof. Typically what this means is that the street wall of your top floor will be a sloped roof with a set of dormers, as you see here. Thus, Napoleon and Haussmann create a unified urban landscape in Paris that painters have taken advantage of and celebrate. I think the one in the upper left is still my favorite. This is the new Parisian lifestyle that is constructed, either for the flaneur who is walking about, or those sitting at a sidewalk cafe, or the new apartment dweller to stand outside and observe the life along the sidewalk. Now, I had my own experience the first time I was in Paris, and it wasn't all that hot, because my wife and I had a 4-hour layover at Charles de Gaulle Airport on our way to Copenhagen. I thought, this might be the only time we get to see Paris, so we should take the Air France bus to the Arc de Triomphe and walk along the Champs-Élysées. We got there in less time than I thought, so I said, let's go have a romantic lunch in some cafe before we go back to the airport. We had a wonderful lunch. I looked at my watch. There was plenty of time, and we returned to catch the bus. And that's when my plan fell apart, for all the corners looked the same. Neither of us remembered at which street we had to meet the bus. There are 12 streets that all meet at the Etoile or the Rotary, and all the corners look the same. Damn you, Haussmann! They all looked alike! Fortunately, my wife soon found the street and our bus stop, and we got back to catch our plane in time. Phew. I am, however, more interested in the foreground buildings erected during the Second Empire than these background apartment buildings. So now that you know what is going to happen with Paris's urban design, let's pick up where we left Paris's architecture prior to Louis Napoleon's rise to the imperial throne. Starting with Soufflot's Sainte-Geneviève, we saw the evolution of French rational classicism, where the buildings have these monumental masonry classical exteriors, whose style can date back to 1500, be it Renaissance, Baroque, or Neoclassical, which at this time was the exact opposite of what we just saw Americans erecting, that is, the cast iron front in a variety of architectural styles. These French monumental stone exteriors, however, were used to wrap very innovative, rationally Gothic-inspired structures that are using more and more iron. In 1847, just before the revolt starts, we saw this theory manifested in the designs of both Labrousse's Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève and the Gare de l'Est. Napoleon was elected president in December 1848, and as his four-year term as president began in 1849, the Brits threw down the gauntlet to French assumed cultural superiority with the largest building ever erected, the Crystal Palace, saying, quote, "In your face, monsieur," unquote. Louis Napoleon, as a member of the Bonaparte family, had spent much of his exile when not in Switzerland in London, especially the last 2 years prior to his political return in 1848, where he had taken careful notes on everything, including the design of Hyde Park, which he would use as his inspiration for the Bois de Boulogne that he would commission in Paris. The British cultural models of the time would constantly goad him to seek to replicate and even surpass these in the design of his capital. One of Napoleon's first urban projects in Paris was a competition to redesign the market area of Paris, Les Halles, in an effort to deflect some of the world's attention away from the competition for the Crystal Palace. Two of France's leading designers, Hector Hérault, the architect of the Jardin de Ville, and Eugène Flachet, France's leading railroad engineer who had designed the Gare Saint-Lazare, both submitted innovative designs, but the commission was given to Victor Baltard, who at this time was a city architect. Baltard had designed a rather conventional building, employing masonry pavilions with arches that recalled Labrousse's recently completed Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève that enclosed an interior skylighted courtyard. The cornerstone was finally laid on September 15, 1851, while the Crystal Palace was still open and standing. Construction of the first pavilion had continued fitfully through the political machinations that led to Napoleon proclaiming himself as emperor in December 1852, and was finally completed in June 1853. Meanwhile, prior to 1848, we also saw over 50 passages or arcades built in Paris that comprised of masonry walls with an iron and glass skylighted roof that clearspanned an alley or an actual street. And the ultimate Parisian gallery we saw was the Jardin de Ville, designed by Hector Hérault in 1847, just prior to Napoleon's rise to power. We return to the Crystal Palace once again. Although its main span was made of wood, the iron and glass Crystal Palace had moved the bar higher in the competition between the traditional blood enemies of Great Britain and France. After all, only 35 years, not even a generation, had passed since the Duke of Wellington, who was in attendance at the opening of the fair, had once and for all defeated Napoleon I at Waterloo, after having been at war for over 20 years. And following Prince Albert's great geopolitical gamble on inviting the French to take part in the 1851 World's Fair, Napoleon's nephew would lead a coup d'etat in France only 6 weeks after the fair had closed its doors. The following year, in December 1852, Louis Napoleon had proclaimed himself once again as emperor of a second French empire, seemingly confirming the suspicions of the prince's harshest critics. But Napoleon III was a very clever politician. After all, he did not become the longest ruling person in French history since the Revolution solely on his good looks. He had a long-term vision to restore le gloire to his country, but while the times had changed since 1815, his primary enemy was none other than Tsar Nicholas I, the younger brother of Tsar Alexander I, who had defeated his uncle in 1812 and again in 1815. This time, Napoleon III would make peace with the British because he needed their help in order to mutually defeat the Russians in the upcoming Crimean War. Within 4 months of proclaiming the Second Empire, Napoleon III decreed on March 8, 1853, that Paris would hold a World's Fair in 1855, as an obvious public relations move to help gain acceptance among Europe's aristocracy of his usurping France's royal throne once again, and as an attempt to set the concerns of France's great enemy, Britain, at ease over his growing power. While construction on the fair began, events in Anatolia led up to the declaration of war between Russia and France allied with Britain in early 1854. The site that he had chosen for the fair lay between the Seine River and the Champs-Élysées and sat in back of the Place de la Concorde. Opposite Napoleon's great Tuileries Palace, that he at this time was finishing the construction that would link it with the Louvre Palace. As the opening day, May 15, 1855, approached, France and Great Britain had been engaged since September of the prior year in the siege of the Russian port Sevastopol. A master at public relations, Napoleon made a state visit to Britain with only 2 weeks before the fair was to open, to shore up British support with Queen Victoria and to ensure that she would come to France and visit the fair. Napoleon's trip had been a resounding success and ensured Britain's continued support in the war effort, as well as Victoria's historic state visit to Paris and the fair in August 1855. The first time a British sovereign had visited France since Henry VI's coronation in Notre Dame as the English King of France in 1431, over 400 years ago. The Palace of Industry was designed by Jean-Marie Viel in conjunction with 2 of France's leading civil engineers, revealing the French preference for architecture with a monumental masonry exterior. In this case, it is as if the British Crystal Palace was surrounded by a masonry corset and pulled so tight that the iron and glass body seemed to bulge out on the exterior due to the inner pressure. As a Second Empire building, we have the essential parts of a classically detailed masonry exterior that one equates with the Académie des Beaux-Arts. A central entrance pavilion framed by corner pavilions with appropriately scattered heroic human sculptures. The only missing detail from the typical Second Empire building is a Monsod roof that simply didn't fit this particular program. Once again, the influence of Labrousse's elevational scheme for the library at Sainte-Geneviève is readily apparent. A ground story comprised of a masonry wall with arched windows that supports an arcade that provides daylight for the interior. The only difference between the two being that the fair building doesn't have stacks placed against this wall, so Viel can completely infill his arcade with glass. But note, he made the mistake of dividing the arches in half with his mullions, as opposed to using a tripartite division of mullions. Viel was also more traditional with the design of his entry, rightly so in this case, for instead of Labrousse's humble, centrally located but underscaled doorway, he added an appropriately scaled, triumphal arched entrance portico. In the triangular areas above the arch, on each side, were located angels blowing a trumpet. Above the building's name is located a frieze with people from all over the world bringing gifts of art, agriculture, and industry to Napoleon III in the center, who is adorned with a laurel wreath. The portico was surmounted with a heroic sculptural group by Elias Robert, featuring France, crowned with a star halo with victory wreaths in both hands, crowning industry with its hammer on the left, and art with its sketchpad on the right. Does Robert's France statue remind you of anyone else you know? Unfortunately, all of the exterior's carved stone, which was 3 foot thick and 60 feet high, wasn't completed by the opening of the fair, which was one of the reasons why Paxton got the Crystal Palace contract, because plate glass is a lot easier to install than carving stone in place. I really like this slide of its construction. Here at the bottom left is the stone being delivered that will have to be installed, but not until the cast iron columns and wrought iron trussed arches have been erected. This image reveals not only that the stone is superfluous to the construction, i.e., that it's only decoration, but also how incredibly lightweight iron construction is. Actually, what comes to my mind is Auger's drawing of the primitive hut, with the muse of architecture sitting against a pile of classical stone pieces, pointing to nature's structure and not man's carved stone as the basis for the young architect's understanding of what architecture is about. In section, the Palace of Industry reminds us of a French Gothic cathedral, that is, a central nave flanked on either side by a two-storied side aisle. It even worked like this in structure, as the double column frames that separate the side aisles from the nave act as buttresses to support the great trussed arches, as no tie rods were used. In their place, heavy blocks of lead helped to resist the arch's thrust. The only conceptual difference between a Gothic cathedral and the palace, excluding the use of iron, of course, was that one entered the palace on the long side rather than through the short end like a cathedral, and thereby had to walk through the side aisle to get to the nave. With a corresponding rotation of one's spatial experience from the long Gothic tunnel to the broad frontal Roman basilica which opened to one's left and right, which unfortunately I cannot find an image of, as the grand length of the Palais was obviously the more compelling of the two views. At 158 feet, this was the longest roof span at the time, 16 feet longer than the Pantheon, giving Napoleon his brief moment of architectural glory, but it was only 630 feet long, only one-third the length of the Crystal Palace. Had the French even tried to match the Crystal Palace length, one can only wonder how long it would have taken to complete such a grand exterior of carved stone. But the interior was built in cast iron, and just look at the quality of the ornamental cast iron work. The building's huge glass roof was an environmental nightmare, as its long side faced southwest, and the building was known for its lack of ventilation. As was done with the Crystal Palace, an awning was eventually installed to reduce heat gain from the sun. Here are two more images of the interior awning. As I mentioned, the length of the palace was only one-third the length of the Crystal Palace, so it didn't take the French very long into its construction to realize that it simply wasn't big enough for the planned exhibits. Two more temporary buildings had to be erected by opening day to house all of the exhibits. A Pavilion des Beaux-Arts to contain the fine arts, which the British had intended to in 1851 but never got around to, meaning the French had achieved an international first. The most important one for us was the Gallery of Machines. It ran for 1,200 meters, almost 4,000 feet along the banks of the Seine, with a clear span of 91 feet. Again, note that a monumental masonry entrance was placed in front of the iron structure. Its construction mirrored that of the Palace of Industry, only with a smaller span. Meanwhile, as initial plans were being drawn up for the Palace of Industry, the first pavilion of Victor Baltard's Le Hall was finally completed in June 1853. General criticism of the completed pavilion had forced the emperor to inspect the structure, after which he agreed with the critics and demanded that it be torn down so as not to be an artistic liability during the upcoming fair, professionally embarrassing Bonaparte. The failure of the pavilion's design was also the final straw that broke the emperor's dissatisfaction with the current prefect of the Seine that he had inherited when he was elected president, whom he proceeded to sack 3 weeks after demanding the demolition of Bonaparte's pavilion. He quickly named Haussmann as the new prefect of the Seine, and within a week of Haussmann's appointment, it was decided to hold a new competition for the market project. The emperor confided in Haussmann how he wanted the project to look like. Quote, "What I must have are huge umbrellas, umbrellas of glass and iron, nothing else," unquote. Obviously influenced by the success of the British Crystal Palace and Paris's recently expanded Gare Saint-Lazare. This would be the only time that a building in Paris would be erected without any stone on its exterior, for even the Palace of Industry had a stone exterior. It seems quite obvious to me that Napoleon was responding to the success of Paxton's Crystal Palace and the mounting problems that were becoming obvious with the start of the construction of the stone front of the palace. That he unilaterally threw out the Paris Building Code's requirement for a minimum of 50 centimeters thick stone exterior to try to have something as modern looking as a Crystal Palace when people showed up for the World's Fair. Meanwhile, Haussmann, who was personally acquainted with Bonaparte as they had coincidentally attended the Lycée Henri IV together, worked in confidence with him on a new design for the competition. Haussmann stated in his memoirs that he made a more detailed drawing of the emperor's sketch and showed it to Bonaparte with the admonition, quote, "Do a preliminary plan for me as soon as possible using these directions: iron, iron, nothing but iron," unquote. It was no surprise then that Bonaparte was again chosen to be the winner of the competition, and the emperor's new design for the hall was fully implemented. Bonaparte's new design comprised of iron and glass pavilions that had the daylight and openness of the Gare Saint-Lazare, and whose exteriors were enclosed with an infill of masonry, windows, and arched cast-iron trellised spandrels. Each pavilion, a total of 10 in all, consisted of a freestanding cast-iron structure. Therefore, Le Hall represented not only the first appearance of cast iron on the exterior of a Parisian building to any significant degree, but also the first freestanding iron frame in Paris. The interior cast iron work has the same ornamental qualities as that in the Palace of Industry. Here you get a sense of how the daylight flooded through the clerestory windows in one of the pavilions. The 10 pavilions were connected into a completely sheltered complex with skylighted roofs, similar to the Parisian passages, except that Le Hall's covered streets allowed traffic to flow through so that the merchants could supply their stalls. In other words, Le Hall was a mega mall that had actually covered Paris's streets with the iron and glass skylight, protecting the streets from the wind, rain, and snow, creating a complete, protected indoor commercial city. Here is one of the 12 main entrances to the complex. And this is what it feels like to be inside one of those streets. I think Bonaparte accomplished exactly what Napoleon wanted Le Hall to look and feel like. Bonaparte's revised design manifested the process that Haussmann would successfully employ in rebuilding Paris. The existing site, including street patterns, more than 10 blocks of Paris, were thoroughly demolished in order that the new rational grid of streets and the 10 new modern iron and glass buildings, complete with the skylighted streets, could be erected. We will call this process in post-World War II America urban renewal, up to and including the creation of a megablock. The best example will be the World Trade Center in New York City. The only difference between the World Trade Center and Les Halles is that the existing streets were not allowed to continue in the World Trade Center, while the French needed to allow the streets to go through the site in order to provide access for the carts supplying the merchants. So then here is the Parisian arcade, covered for your comfort, daylight coming through the clear story on a sunny day, or dry and protected when it is 40 degrees and rainy and windy. A great place to go shopping in Paris, especially in the 1860s. Unfortunately, the French continued with their tradition of wiping the slate clean by tearing down the entire complex in the early 1970s and replaced it with a rather mundane design, which itself has been recently torn down and replaced with a 21st century version. Le Hall was so successful that Hector Roux in 1862 made a proposal to glass over the new Avenue de l'Opéra. This new technology now allows us to improve life, so why not use it to the fullest? One wonders if Napoleon III had stayed in power beyond 1870, whether or not the French would have begun to do this. Because in 1865, this was actually being done in Milan. And Napoleon III was indirectly responsible for it, for he had made a deal with King Vittorio Emanuele of Sardinia, one of the Italian leaders trying to unite the Italian peninsula by pushing the Austrians back across the Alps. The deal was, for an Italian alliance in the Crimean War against Russia, France would help the Italians push the Austrians out, and in exchange, France would get control of Nice and Savoy, enlarging the landmass of France. Napoleon III personally commanded over 90,000 French troops at the Battle of Solferino that, allied with 40,000 Italian Piedmontese troops, defeated Austrian troops and finally pushed them out of northern Italy, allowing the declaration of the Kingdom of Italy 2 years later. The importance of the victory by the French-Italian army was that it had liberated Milan from Austrian control. In anticipation of its new freedom, the city's leaders immediately began planning new urban projects that would befit what they believed their city would become in the new country of Italy. Premier among these plans was a more cohesive Piazza del Duomo in front of the city's famous cathedral, as well as a new pedestrian connection between it and the city's other world-famous landmark, the La Scala Opera House. Here you can see the awkward shape of the cathedral's old piazza. The new plan was nothing less than pure Napoleon houseman, to cut a path straight through the city's medieval fabric by demolishing the entire neighborhood and building new, up-to-date structures. Much of its financing would be provided by British investors. From 1860 to 1864, a series of competitions refined the design by Giuseppe Mangione to build a 4-story arcade between the two piazzas, with an intersecting arcade whose intersection was to be topped with a dome. As the Milanese had built their cathedral at the end of the Gothic period, just before the start of the Renaissance, it had erected a Gothic cathedral, while Florence and Rome followed this with domed cathedrals. This was the opportunity for Milan to finally build its dome to compete with its sister cities. From this overview, you can see what Mangione had proposed. First, he opened up and regularized the shape of the piazza in front of the cathedral. Then he used the street at the left of the cathedral, facing it, as his baseline for a new rectilinear street grid of courtyarded multi-story blocks. First, the walls of the buildings that defined the arcade were erected. The first king of the new country of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele II, for whom the gallery was named, laid the first stone in 1865. Once these buildings were completed by the British contractor, they then erected the wrought iron and glass that was provided by 2 French companies, skylights over the streets, creating the arcades or passages. For the engineers, note that the arches are not trusses, but Varendale trusses. Look carefully and you will see that there are no diagonal members. Once the arcade's barrel vaults were in place, work could commence on the iron and glass dome. Although the dome did not equal either the span or the height of either Florence or St. Peter's, Its diameter was only 127 feet versus 142 feet for the older masonry domes. One could argue that the effect of its transparency more than made up for the deficit. When I look at the centering required for the erection of the dome, I can't help seeing the influence of Brunelleschi's Florence dome construction equipment on this project, which, in my opinion, only further enhances the magnitude of the achievement of Brunelleschi's design more than 400 years earlier. Unbelievably, the interior was completed in only 2 years, with the king once again inaugurating the building in 1867. But it wasn't completed, as the entrance took another 9 years to complete, as the British developer and contractor both went bankrupt. Eventually, to finish his building, Mangione signed a contract in October 1876 to be the contractor to complete the building's exterior. Mangione's exterior design reveals a similarity to, of all buildings, the entrance to Napoleon III's 1855 Palace of Industry. The tragedy of this building is that Mangione had signed a contract with a completion deadline of December 31st, 1877, which he had met. On the evening of turning the building over to the city on that date, he was inspecting some of the work and fell from the scaffolding, killing himself. He had designed the ideal urban destination spot, especially at night when 600 gas jets ringing the interior of the base of the dome would be lit one at a time at dusk by a machine with a flint that traveled around a track. Mark Twain, who visited the Galleria during a European tour in the late 1860s, including this following description of it in his 1880 travel novel, A Tramp Abroad. Quote, "Blocks of new buildings of the most sumptuous sort, rich with decoration and graced with statues. The streets between these blocks roofed over with glass at a great height, the pavements all of smooth and variegated marble, arranged in tasteful patterns, little tables all over these marble streets, people sitting at them, eating, drinking, or smoking, crowds of other people strolling by. Such is the arcade. I should like to live in it all my life." Unquote. And so, the Europeans were once again building cathedrals, but now these were cathedrals devoted not to religion, but to commerce. So while Napoleon III was building Le Hall, which had inspired Hector Hérault to propose covering the new Avenue de l'Opéra with iron and glass, which was exactly what the Milanese were erecting with the Galleria. Indeed, what J.C. Loudon had predicted back in 1817, over 40 years earlier, that entire cities would be enclosed in iron and glass, seemed to be coming true. Hérault had made his proposal to cover the new Avenue de l'Opéra that Haussmann was then constructing to frame the crowning building of Napoleon III's Paris urban renewal campaign, the Paris Opera House, the building of the Second Empire. Designed by Charles Garnier, urban legend has him standing next to the Empress Eugenie at the building's cornerstone laying ceremony. She turns to him and nonchalantly asks, "What style is the building designed in, Greek or Roman?" And he wisely responds without hesitation, "But of course, madame, it is the style of Napoleon III, the Second Empire." A highly ornate, monumental, eclectic mix of the various classical styles, sometimes spoken of in a disparaging way because it was the product of Louis Napoleon, who was seen by France's cultural grandees, if you will, as one who did not have the proper breeding, and therefore they had assumed he believed the more ornament the better. The word used for a person of a lower class who has made good and is trying to act like his betters is a parvenu. Let's start with the urban, large scale, and work our way down to the small details. The building is placed in a new neighborhood that was completely bulldozed, and a whole new street was built with apartments lining it, framing it at the end of the vista. As it is to be a public, institutional building, it is supposed to stand out, as opposed to the background nature of the apartment buildings. One way to make it stand out is to locate it back from the street, creating its own space within which it stands, again, as opposed to the apartment buildings that are built up to the sidewalk. All non-institutional buildings in an urban setting, as a rule, will be built up to the sidewalk, creating a street fabric within a city until the European modernists, better known as the International Style, propose to set their buildings back from the street so as to have their own space or plaza in front of them. The first such building will be Mises Seagram's building in New York during the mid-1950s. When we look at the opera's exterior, we have the three requisite pieces of the Second Empire style: the classically detailed masonry exterior, topped with a mansard roof, in this case the central dome, and a good spattering of monumental human sculptures. The exterior massing is done in the standard Beaux-Arts manner of giving exterior expression to each of the building's major spaces. In this case, you can see from the front and the sides the three parts of the building: the main body, the auditorium via its dome above, and the stage house. Note that as one approaches the front entry, perspective slowly hides the dome and the stage house, leaving only the facade of the main body. The most important space of architecture as urban theater was the grand stairway, marked by the arrow. Going to the theater and being seen while doing so is at least as important as seeing the production, and so Garnier created an indoor living room for one to be seen in, that is as large and actually taller than the center void of the auditorium. The emperor was to have his own entrance with ramps for his carriage. As you see here, it was on the west side that has a better chance of daylight in the early evening. In comparison to subscription holders who had their own carriage drop off on the opposite east side. The subscription holder's entrance leads to a private reception lobby, here marked by the arrow, where one may wait for your guests to arrive. Before one ascends to the grand stairs, where you will be seen by one and all. If you have purchased a ticket for only this night's performance, you will enter in the front, into the lobby, and up the stairs to the piece de resistance, the grand stairway. He gives Parisian society an indoor showcase which, in Paris, is the performance, prior to walking into the actual theater performance. Everyone comes to be seen, and everybody is standing around, looking down to see who's coming in next. It performs that function just perfectly. And then, finally, you move to the auditorium and take your seat. And you look around, and it's glorious. It took forever to complete. Look at the drop curtain. It is actually a painting. The ceiling mural, however, is new, done in 1960 by Marc Chagall over the original one. But what I want you to do is look at the cross-section of the roof over the auditorium, because what's amazing is how much space there is in this dome that originally wasn't used. It's like the false roof on the French Gothic cathedrals, to give the space a presence on the exterior, but look, it's almost as high as the auditorium itself, isn't it? It's now intermission, the time when we all go to see and be seen. We are all dressed up in our best gown or tails, and we want to strut our stuff, right? And so we walk around the grand stairway so we can be seen and head for the Intermission Hall, marked by the arrow. This is the room that blows me away. It's unbelievable, because Garnier tried the best Versailles Hall of Mirrors, and I think he did it. You then continue to proceed out to the balcony for a smoke. and you get a gorgeous view down the new Avenue de l'Opéra all the way to the Louvre. That 2 hours ago you had traveled up to the Opera House. A perfect recapitulation of your arrival sequence. The detailing on the exterior matches that in the interior. It's highlighted with gold leaf that glow in the sun. At the top is Apollo, crowning the city with his lyre. This is the building that is going to be the inspiration for almost every American institutional building designed during the 1870s. Unfortunately, the emperor would never live to see the opening night of the building that best represented his dreams for Paris. As we will soon see, war with the Prussians will be the end of Napoleon III and his Second Empire. He will die while in exile once again in Britain, 2 years before his magnificent house was completed in January 1875. After the end of the Franco-Prussian War, it was decided to stop construction of the Emperor's entrance pavilion, which you see here, leaving us a poetic image, I think, of Napoleon III's dream for Paris. But do not think that Second Empire was the only style being erected in the Paris of Napoleon III, for as I have tried to show, he was a very clever politician, and he often let conflicting styles in painting, as well as architecture, coexist if for no other reason than to quiet some of his political critics, who justifiably complained about his authoritative rule, while he simultaneously spouted the availability of universal suffrage for all French males. And of course, as was the case in Great Britain, the competing design ideology at this moment was the Gothic revival.